The Samurai's Last Stand, Japan's Final Warriors of 1877. The twilight of an era. The year was 1877, and Japan stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the old and the new. The dawn of the Meiji era had brought steamships, telegraphs, and rifles to a land once ruled by sword and honor. But for the samurai, the warrior class that had governed Japan for nearly 8 centuries, this new age felt like betrayal. The clatter of armor was fading into silence, replaced by the clang of factories and the hum of Western machines. In the quiet southern province of Satsuma, once a proud stronghold of warriors, tension simmered like a dormant volcano. The government in Tokyo had stripped the samurai of their stipends, banned the wearing of swords, and imposed taxes that crushed the old warrior families. The samurai, bound by centuries of Bushido, the way of the warrior, felt their honor slipping away. Their swords, once symbols of pride, now hung uselessly on their walls, reminders of a fading legacy. Among them was Saigō Takamori, a man of immense respect, known to friend and foe alike as the last true samurai. Once a trusted advisor to Emperor Meiji and a hero of the Restoration, Saigō had retired from politics in disillusionment. He had fought to modernize Japan but now saw his beloved traditions being erased in the name of progress. When corruption spread among the new bureaucrats and the samurai were cast aside like relics, Saigō's heart grew heavy with sorrow. In the cold winter months of early 1877, whispers filled the taverns and tea houses of Satsuma. Men spoke of rebellion, of reclaiming honor from the hands of officials who had forgotten their roots. Young warriors trained in secret, oiling their katana, practicing old drills under the moonlight. They looked to Saigō, their teacher, their symbol of righteousness. At first, he resisted. He wanted peace. But as reports arrived of samurai being humiliated and disarmed in other provinces, he could no longer stand idle. When emissaries from Tokyo arrived to confiscate Satsuma's weapons, it was the final insult. The government feared that the province would rise, and in that fear, they ignited the very flame they sought to extinguish. The warehouses where rifles and ammunition were stored were raided. Armed men took to the streets. By February 1877, banners of rebellion fluttered over Kagoshima, Satsuma's capital. Saigō Takamori, reluctant yet resolute, accepted his fate. He would lead his people not for power, but for honor. If the government has abandoned justice, he told his followers, then it is our duty to stand for it. A samurai's life is not measured in years, but in the purity of his cause. They formed the Satsuma army, numbering some 40,000 men, many of them former samurai, veterans of the Boshin War, hardened by years of discipline. Their armor was old, their swords polished, and their spirits unyielding. Against them stood the Imperial Japanese army, trained in Western tactics and armed with modern rifles and artillery, over 300,000 soldiers ready to defend the new Japan. But Saigō's men were not fighting for politics. They fought for a dying way of life, for loyalty, courage, and the code that had shaped Japan for centuries. As they marched north toward Kumamoto Castle, the cherry blossoms began to fall, petals drifting like snow across the countryside. To the samurai, each petal symbolized a warrior's death, beautiful, brief, and honorable. Villagers bowed as the columns passed, whispering prayers for the men who went to die. In the nights around their campfires, old soldiers told tales of the glory days, of great battles fought under the Tokugawa shoguns, of loyalty unto death. The young recruits listened in silence, eyes shining with both pride and fear. They knew the rifles of the Imperial army could mow them down before they even reached striking distance. Yet none spoke of retreat. To live dishonored was worse than to die. When Saigō reached the outskirts of Kumamoto, he halted his army and gazed upon the towering fortress, a massive black castle rising from the mist. Inside were government troops, loyal to Tokyo and commanded by Major General Tani Tadaki, an old friend of Saigō's from the Restoration Wars. Now they stood on opposite sides, brothers divided by fate. On the morning of February 22, 1877, Saigō ordered his troops to surround the castle. Drums echoed through the hills. The siege of Kumamoto had begun. Cannon fire shattered the silence, and the smoke of gunpowder drifted over the fields like a funeral shroud. The samurai, charging with swords drawn, faced walls bristling with modern rifles. The clash of past and future had begun, a war not just for control, but for the soul of Japan. As night fell and the cries of the wounded filled the air, Saigo stood on a hill overlooking the battlefield. The firelight reflected in his eyes as he whispered, "If this is the end of our way, then let it be written in blood and courage." The Siege of Kumamoto Castle. The siege of Kumamoto Castle raged on with unrelenting ferocity. For over a week, the thunder of cannon and the rattle of rifles echoed through the valleys of Kyushu. The black walls of the ancient fortress, built in the early 1600s, stood as a symbol of endurance. Inside, the Imperial army held their ground, short on supplies but bolstered by modern weapons. Outside, Saigō Takamori's warriors, the proud remnants of the samurai, encircled the stronghold like a tightening noose. The rebels fought with an intensity born not of hate, but of conviction. Clad in traditional armor, many wielding only swords or outdated muskets, they charged through bullets and cannon fire. Every death was a statement, a defiance of modernity itself. To them, dying in battle was not defeat, but a passage into immortality. They were the last protectors of an honor that Japan seemed eager to forget. Inside the castle, Major General Tani Tadaki watched the battlefield through a spyglass. He knew Saigo's men well. Many had once fought beside him during the Boshin War. Now they were enemies. The irony stung him deeply. He respected Saigō, even revered him, but he had sworn allegiance to the emperor, and that oath bound him to the new order. "We cannot turn back time," Tani whispered to his adjutant. "But we can at least honor those who cannot move forward." The siege quickly turned into a stalemate. The samurai, though brave, lacked heavy artillery and supplies. Their swords clashed against stone walls that no longer yielded to valor. Meanwhile, Imperial reinforcements began to gather in nearby provinces, cutting off Satsuma's communication lines. Food grew scarce, ammunition dwindled, yet, Saigō's men refused to retreat. At night, the camps were lit by the orange glow of torches. The sound of shamisen, the three-stringed lute, drifted through the cold air as soldiers sang old songs of loyalty and death. Around the fires, Saigō moved among them, speaking softly, offering words of encouragement. To each man, he gave the same message: a samurai's duty is not to live long, but to die well. If we must fall, let it be as warriors, not as beggars of a foreign crown. One cold morning, under a pale gray sky, a young warrior named Shinbei approached Saigō. Barely 20, he had left behind his wife and newborn son to join the cause. He bowed deeply. "Sensei," he said, "do you think we can still win?" Saigō looked at him, his eyes heavy with both kindness and sorrow. "Victory is not always measured by survival," he replied. "Even if we fall, our spirit will remain. The world must see that honor cannot be erased by gunpowder." The next day, the rebels launched a massive assault on the western gate of Kumamoto Castle. Thousands of samurai stormed forward, banners of crimson and white fluttering in the wind. Their battle cries shook the very earth. Bullets tore through their ranks, but still they came, cutting down the front lines with their katanas. For a moment, it seemed as if the old way might prevail. But the Imperial army had machine guns now, imported from France. Within minutes, the field was littered with the fallen. The charge was broken, and the survivors crawled back through the mud, carrying the wounded. The cost was devastating. Of the 5,000 who had charged, fewer than 1,000 returned alive. Saigō stood amid the carnage, his face calm but pale. "They fight with fire," he murmured, "and we fight with the wind. But the wind must blow, even against the storm." By mid-March, the Imperial army launched its counterattack. Reinforcements arrived from Tokyo and Osaka, armed with new rifles and Gatling guns. The siege lines were crushed under artillery bombardments that shook the hills. The samurai were forced to retreat southward, abandoning their dead and their dreams behind the smoking ruins. It was then that the war began to change from open battle to desperate resistance. The Satsuma army, once numbering 40,000, had been reduced to half. Supplies were nearly gone, yet morale, strangely, remained high. The men believed that as long as Saigō Takamori lived, their cause could not truly die. They retreated through mountain passes and rivers, always pursued, always fighting. In village after village, the people offered them food, shelter, and prayers. To the common folk, Saigō was not a rebel, he was a hero, a man who stood for justice when the government had grown greedy and cold. One rainy evening, the rebels took refuge in a mountain temple. The rain drummed on the roof as Saigō sat before a small altar, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his weathered face. His lieutenant, Beppu Shinsuke, approached. "General," he said quietly, "our men are tired. Many are wounded. The Imperial army surrounds us. We cannot hold out much longer." Saigō nodded slowly. "I know. But as long as the heart beats, duty remains. We fight not for victory, but for meaning. If Japan must have a new dawn, let it rise upon the blood of those who kept faith." He reached into his robe and withdrew a letter, addressed to Emperor Meiji himself. In it, he wrote of loyalty, not treason, of the pain of change, not rebellion. "I do not rise against the emperor," the letter said, "but against those who have poisoned his court with greed and dishonor." He sealed the letter, though he knew it might never reach its destination. As dawn broke, the samurai prepared once more for battle. Some wrote farewell poems, a tradition as old as the blade itself. One wrote, "The cherry falls, its fragrance lost to wind. Yet beauty lingers." By April, Kumamoto Castle was free. The Imperial army had broken the siege. But in freeing the castle, they had trapped the samurai, cutting off their path north. The government declared Saigō and his men traitors. Bounties were placed upon their heads. Posters across Japan branded them enemies of the state. Yet in the hearts of the people, they were something else entirely, legends. As Saigō led his men deeper into the mountains, the fires of rebellion burned lower, but their light reached far. Across Japan, people whispered, "The last samurai still fight." Children in distant villages imitated them with bamboo swords, dreaming of courage in a world of iron and steam. The mountains of Kyushu became their refuge, and soon, their grave. The fall of the samurai army. The spring rains turned the fields of Kyushu into rivers of mud. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and blood. The Satsuma Rebellion, once a proud march for honor, had become a desperate struggle for survival. Each passing day thinned the ranks of Saigō Takamori's men, yet their resolve never wavered. From the ashes of Kumamoto, they had fled south, through the forests of Hitoyoshi, the mountains of Miyazaki, and the valleys of Kagoshima. Their paths were marked by the graves of comrades, hastily buried beneath the trees. Behind them, the Imperial army advanced with modern precision, cutting off supply routes, torching villages suspected of aiding the rebels. The emperor's soldiers wore Western-style uniforms, blue and gray, their rifles gleaming under the sun. They moved like machines, disciplined, organized, unstoppable. Against them, the samurai fought as their ancestors had, with valor and spirit, but little else. They carried the katana and the spirit of Bushido, yet their courage could not pierce bullets and shells. Still, Saigō's men found small victories. In mountain passes and narrow ravines, they ambushed government troops, striking like tigers from the mist. They fought with bows, spears, and the few rifles they had scavenged. Each battle cost them dearly, but each one was fought with unshakable dignity. By May, their army had dwindled to fewer than 10,000 men. Food was scarce, gunpowder scarcer still. The men boiled roots and leaves for meals, drank from rivers, and used their tattered uniforms as bandages. Yet every morning, they stood in formation, bowed to the rising sun, and recited the code of the warrior. To serve with loyalty, to die with honor, to live with integrity. These words, once ceremonial, had become a prayer. One evening, under the crimson glow of sunset, Beppu Shinsuke, Saigō's loyal lieutenant, approached his commander. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken with exhaustion. "General," he said softly, "we cannot go on much longer. The men are starving. The wounded, they have no medicine. We need to surrender before all is lost." Saigō sat upon a rock, watching the distant hills shimmer in the fading light. "Surrender," he murmured. "How does one surrender a soul?" Beppu fell silent. He knew his commander's heart. Saigō did not fight for power or rebellion. He fought because the spirit of Japan, the spirit of honor, was being buried beneath Western steel. "We cannot win," Beppu said. "But perhaps, we can die well." Saigō nodded slowly. "Then we die as samurai should." As the days passed, their journey took them through the quiet countryside, where villagers knelt and offered rice and water to the weary soldiers. Many wept as they saw the once proud samurai reduced to ghosts of men. To the people, Saigō was not a rebel, he was a living legend, a man who had defied corruption with nothing but his faith in righteousness. The imperial government, fearful of his growing myth, redoubled its efforts. Tens of thousands of soldiers poured into Kyushu, closing the noose. Warships patrolled the coast, while telegraphs carried orders across the nation. Saigo's army, outnumbered more than 10 to 1, became a phantom force, always retreating, yet never captured. In early July, a violent clash erupted at Mount Enadake, where Saigo's remaining men made their stand. The mountain slopes ran red as samurai and soldiers met in brutal close combat. Gunfire shattered the forest, mingling with the cries of men. The samurai, low on bullets, drew their swords and charged. It was a scene from another century, a dance of death between two ages. By the end of the day, the mountain was silent. Bodies lay strewn across the slopes like fallen leaves. The Satsuma army had been shattered. Only a few hundred survived. Among them was Saigo himself, wounded but alive. His right leg had been grazed by a bullet, his robe soaked in blood. Yet he refused to leave the battlefield until the last man had fallen. When the survivors gathered, Saigo addressed them. His voice was calm, his presence serene despite the chaos. "My friends," he said, "we have walked the path of duty. Though our bodies may fall, our spirit cannot die. The world will remember us, not as rebels, but as men who lived by their word." The men knelt before him, tears streaking through the dirt on their faces. Many recited death poems, jisei, the final words of a samurai's soul. One wrote, "Even in defeat, my sword shall gleam, the moon upon its edge." That night, the survivors began their march toward Shiroyama, a mountain overlooking Kagoshima Bay, Saigo's homeland. It was there, he decided, that the final stand would be made. The journey was brutal. The rains returned, washing the blood from their clothes but not from their memory. They crossed rivers swollen with floodwaters, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Each step brought them closer to home, and to death. In Kagoshima, word of their approach spread like wildfire. The townsfolk gathered at the gates, weeping, as the tattered remnants of the Satsuma army limped into view. Barely 500 men remained, once noble samurai, now broken but unbowed. Yet as they entered the city, the people bowed deeply, calling out, "Long live Saigo-sama." Saigo, his armor dented and his body trembling with exhaustion, dismounted his horse. "This will be our final field," he said. "Let the mountains bear witness." On the night of September 23, 1877, the samurai took their positions on the slopes of Mount Shiroyama. They had no artillery, no reinforcements, and little ammunition. The Imperial army surrounded them with 30,000 troops, cannons, and warships stationed in the bay. The samurai, numbering fewer than 500, sharpened their swords and waited. They lit small fires and prepared their final meals, rice balls wrapped in seaweed, the last taste of home. Some prayed to their ancestors, others polished their katanas until they gleamed like silver under the moonlight. Saigo walked among them, offering words of peace. "You have done enough," he said softly. "Tomorrow, we return to the gods." As dawn approached, a hush fell over the camp. The men bowed to the rising sun for the last time. The Battle of Shiroyama, the final dawn. The morning of September 24, 1877, rose cold and gray over the hills of Shiroyama. Mist rolled down from the mountain peaks, curling around the makeshift camp of Saigō Takamori and his remaining warriors. Below them, the Imperial army waited, a sea of soldiers stretching across the valleys, their bayonets glinting like the teeth of a steel dragon. Cannons stood ready, aimed at the slopes where the last samurai prepared to meet their fate. There were fewer than 500 men left beside Saigo, many wounded, all exhausted. Their uniforms were torn, their feet blistered, and their bellies empty. But in their eyes burned the same fierce light that had guided Japan's warriors for centuries. They did not speak of fear, nor of surrender. To them, this was not an ending, it was the fulfillment of their purpose. The Imperial commander, General Yamagata Aritomo, had once studied under Saigo. He respected the man deeply, but duty compelled him to crush the rebellion once and for all. "He is the finest man Japan has produced," Yamagata said quietly to his staff, "but the age of the sword is over." He ordered his forces to encircle the mountain completely, cutting off any escape. More than 30,000 troops, equipped with artillery and rifles, surrounded Shiroyama. Warships in Kagoshima Bay aimed their cannons at the slopes. Saigo's men were trapped between the guns of the sea and the rifles of the army. The modern world had closed its fist around the last of the old. At dawn, the bombardment began. The ground shook as cannon fire rained down upon the mountain, tearing through trees and rock. The air filled with smoke and flame. The samurai huddled behind what little cover they could find: fallen logs, stones, the bodies of comrades. Yet no one fled. They waited patiently for the barrage to end, polishing their swords, whispering prayers, and composing their final verses. Saigo, dressed in his simple uniform, stood atop a ridge, gazing at the rising sun through the haze. His face was calm, his expression almost serene. "The time has come," he said to Beppu Shinsuke, his loyal second. "Let us meet death with honor." Beppu bowed deeply. "As you have taught us, Saigo-sama. To die well is to live forever." When the bombardment ceased, the samurai prepared for their final charge. Smoke drifted across the field like a ghostly shroud. The Imperial soldiers, expecting another barrage, were caught off guard when the rebels suddenly emerged from the mist, swords raised, voices echoing in unison. For honor and Japan, the samurai charged down the slope, a storm of steel and spirit. Their armor clattered, their banners fluttered in the wind. They cut through the first line of Imperial troops with the precision of lightning. The enemy's rifles cracked like thunder, mowing down wave after wave, but the samurai pressed on. Even when struck, they fought on their knees, slashing until their last breath. It was not a battle, it was a sacrifice. Saigo himself fought among them, his sword flashing like a silver arc. Despite his wound from earlier battles, he moved with the grace of a seasoned warrior, cutting down foes with a quiet, deadly calm. Every movement spoke of mastery, of centuries of training honed to perfection. Yet for every soldier he struck down, 10 more took their place. The Imperial troops, overwhelmed by the sheer will of their enemies, began to falter. Some refused to fire, their respect for the old master too great. But their officers shouted commands, and the rifles roared again. Bullets tore through armor, through flesh, through the last remnants of an age. Within an hour, more than half of Saigo's men were dead. The survivors fell back toward the upper slopes, forming a final defensive ring around their commander. Saigo's leg was struck by a bullet, shattering the bone. He fell to the ground, clutching his side. Beppu rushed to his aid, kneeling beside him as chaos raged around them. "General," Beppu cried, "you must retreat. The line is broken." Saigo shook his head. "Retreat," he said softly. "There is nowhere left to go." A second shot grazed his chest, and he staggered. Blood darkened his robes. He looked toward the sea, where the sun now gleamed upon the water. "It is beautiful," he whispered. "A good day to die." Beppu's eyes filled with tears. "Allow me to assist you, my lord," he said, his voice trembling. Saigo nodded, understanding the unspoken code. To be captured was shame, to die by one's own blade was the samurai's final honor. Beppu helped his master to a nearby grove, away from the chaos of the battlefield. There, beneath a pine tree, Saigo knelt and faced the east, toward the emperor, toward Japan. He drew his short blade, its edge gleaming in the morning light. To the emperor, he murmured, "I have been unfaithful only in failing to serve him better. May my death cleanse that failure." With a steady hand, Saigo performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai. Beppu knelt behind him and, with a single stroke, ended his master's pain. It was the final act of loyalty, the last echo of Bushido. When the Imperial troops reached the grove, they found Saigo's body lying peacefully, his face calm, his hand still upon his sword. Beppu lay beside him, his blade stained with both blood and devotion. The soldiers bowed their heads in silence. Even the victors could not hold back their grief. The battle ended within hours. Every remaining samurai was either killed in combat or took his own life. When the smoke cleared, Shiroyama was silent. The mountain was littered with the dead, the final warriors of an age that would never return. General Yamagata stood among the ruins, his heart heavy. "We have destroyed the old Japan," he said quietly, "but we have also lost its soul." He ordered that Saigo's body be treated with respect. A simple grave was dug overlooking the Bay of Kagoshima, his homeland, his beginning, and his end. That night, as the Imperial soldiers withdrew, the wind carried the faint scent of incense and pine. The moon rose over Shiroyama, shining down upon the fallen samurai like a gentle blessing. In the villages below, people lit candles in their windows and whispered prayers for the spirit of Saigō Takamori, the last true samurai. The legacy of the last samurai. When the smoke of Shiroyama cleared, the sun broke through the morning clouds, casting light upon the mountain where the final warriors of Japan had fallen. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavy with grief. The Imperial army, though victorious, moved with bowed heads among the bodies of the men they had slain. Many of them were young soldiers who had grown up hearing tales of samurai honor, and now, they had killed the very embodiment of it. The news of Saigō Takamori's death spread through Japan like wildfire. In villages and cities alike, people wept. Even in the halls of government, ministers lowered their heads in shame. Emperor Meiji himself, upon hearing of Saigo's fate, was said to have fallen into silence for a long time before whispering, "Saigō was a true Japanese." In that single sentence, history was rewritten. The man branded a traitor in life was remembered as a patriot in death. The imperial government officially declared the Satsuma Rebellion ended, marking the close of Japan's feudal age. The modernization of the nation would continue, faster and stronger than before, railways, factories, and Western education reshaping every corner of the archipelago. Yet even as Japan looked to the future, it could not escape the shadow of its past. The death of Saigō Takamori had not only ended a rebellion, it had immortalized a spirit. In Kagoshima, thousands of mourners climbed Mount Shiroyama to pay their respects. Women laid flowers upon the graves, children knelt in silence, and old samurai, stripped of their swords and status, wept openly. They spoke of Saigō not as a defeated rebel, but as a man who had remained true when the world had changed around him. "He died for honor," one said. And honor never dies. Years passed. Japan transformed. Steamships filled its harbors, telegraph wires connected its islands, and the Imperial Army, once a small modern experiment, became a mighty force. The old ways faded into museums and stories. Yet, in the heart of every Japanese soul, there lingered a longing, a quiet reverence for the simplicity and purity of the age of the sword. In 1889, Emperor Meiji issued a full pardon for Saigō Takamori. His name was restored, his honor redeemed. Statues were raised in his memory, the most famous standing in Ueno Park, Tokyo, showing him in simple robes, walking his dog, sword at his side. Beneath the statue, carved into stone, were the words, "Saigō Takamori, the last samurai." Tourists and students came to gaze upon the statue, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of what it meant to live with integrity. The Japanese people, now rushing toward industrial greatness, found comfort in remembering the man who had stood for values that machines could never forge: loyalty, courage, and moral strength. But the story of the last samurai did not end with bronze and marble. It lived on in art, in song, and in spirit. Playwrights wrote dramas of the rebellion, poets composed verses honoring the fallen warriors, and generations of young men studied Bushido, the code of the samurai, as a moral compass in a changing age. Even as Japan entered the 20th century, building empires and battling foreign powers, the ideal of Saigō Takamori remained a light in the nation's conscience. Soldiers of later wars carried small charms engraved with his name. Teachers quoted his words to remind their students that discipline without virtue is hollow. In distant lands, foreign scholars too were fascinated. They called Saigō, Japan's Kato, a man who chose death over dishonor. Western writers described him as the embodiment of the Japanese soul, the bridge between ancient valor and modern progress. Yet perhaps the truest legacy of Saigō was not in war or politics, but in the quiet lessons of humanity he left behind. He had once written in his journals, "The purpose of the sword is not to take life, but to protect it. To use power justly is the only true strength." Those words became the foundation of Japan's moral awakening. In a world increasingly driven by ambition and technology, Saigō's teachings reminded his people that the heart must remain pure, that progress without honor leads only to ruin. In Kagoshima, the mountain of Shiroyama stands serene. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, monks light lanterns along the slopes. Each flame represents one fallen warrior. When night falls, the mountain glows like a constellation of souls, the last samurai shining against the darkness. If one stands there today, amid the whispering pines and the faint echo of the sea, it is not hard to imagine their presence. The wind carries faint voices, the clash of blades, the cry of battle, the calm command of Saigō calling his men to stand firm. It is as if time itself bows to the memory of that dawn, when 500 men faced 30,000, and refused to yield. Saigō Takamori's grave remains there, overlooking the bay where he was born. The view is peaceful, the city of Kagoshima spread out below, modern and alive, built upon the very soil that drank the blood of its heroes. Tourists still climb the path, some carrying flowers, others merely standing in silence. And when they gaze down upon the bay, they see the Japan that Saigō dreamed of, strong, united, and proud. He had lost the war, but won something far greater, immortality. For the samurai, death was never an end. It was a passage, from the fleeting world of men to the eternal world of honor. And so, in the story of Japan, the name Saigō Takamori is not written in defeat, but in gold. He was the last flame of a dying age, the bridge between sword and rifle, between tradition and modernity. His death marked the twilight of the samurai, but his spirit, fierce and unyielding, became the sunrise of a new Japan. Even today, in the quiet hearts of those who seek courage in the face of change, the whisper of his words endures. To die when one must. To stand when none will. That is the way of the samurai. And thus ended the samurai's last stand, Japan's final warriors of 1877.